This is a very useful and very powerful tool in order to form habits. But what I encourage you to do would be to pick the habit that you want to form, write down or think about very concretely what is the sequence of steps involved in the execution of that habit, and then write down or think about what is the sequence of events that need to precede that habit, and then call the whole thing a habit execution. If you are considering adopting a new habit, or if you are trying to break a habit, something we haven't talked too much about, but we will in a moment, it's very useful to think not just about the procedural aspects of what you're going to do, but also think about the events that precede and follow that particular habit and the execution, or at least the effort to execute that habit. What you're doing is you're casting a kind of a spotlight around a bin of time or a set of events for which dopamine can be associated. What does this look like in the practical sense? Well, again, I'll just try and use very simple, concrete examples, but this could carry over to anything. Let's say I were somebody who has a hard time getting in that 30 to 60 minutes of zone 2 cardiovascular exercise mid-morning. This is actually an issue for me. I much prefer to do resistance exercise than cardiovascular exercise, although once I do it, I always feel much better that I have done it. What I should do is positively anticipate the onset and the offset of that session, right? So thinking about leaning into the effort, going out and doing that zone 2 cardio session, and I should think about how I'm going to feel after. So not just thinking about how great I'm going to feel after, but also thinking about how hard it's going to be at the beginning, and then trying to reward myself subjectively for the entire experience. In other words, start rewarding task bracketing in addition to rewarding the execution of the habit itself. Now, some of you might be saying, well, wait, this is all self-talk. This is just positive self-talk. But it's not positive self-talk. It's not saying, I feel so great about doing something that I actually hate. You can't lie to yourself, or you're welcome to lie to yourself. But the neuroscience literature, the literature of growth mindset, all the literature basically of mindset speaks to the fact that when you lie to yourself, you know you're lying, and you actually set up the opposite of a reward system. So you have to be brutally honest with yourself that, for instance, I don't like initiating this cardiovascular exercise, but I do like the fact that I've done it after I've done it. So what you are doing is you are applying reward prediction error to the entire sequence of things that's involved in getting into the habit execution, getting through the habit execution, and getting out of the habit execution. How do you do this? Well, I take us back to our procedural memory visualization exercise that we talked about earlier. When I talked about it in that context, I talked about walking through mentally the series of steps that's required to perform a particular habit. So in the case of the zone 2 cardio thing, it would be, okay, I'm going to put on my shoes, then I'm going to head out the door, then I'm going to drive up the road. There's a particular canyon near here that if I'm going to run, I happen to like running, or I don't hate running enough that I tend to do it. Going through that, heading back, et cetera, et cetera. That's great. But even better would be to broaden the time bin and start to positively anticipate the period headed into the habit. So even before you put on your shoes, the fact that you are successfully placing the habit in this case, phase 1 of the day, and that afterwards I'm going to feel a particular set of positive benefits, elevated mood, etc. I like being hungry, and typically after exercise I'm hungry, so I like being hungry because I like eating. And so there's a whole set of things that link up with one another. So I'm not just thinking about habit execution as this isolated little set of events or this little time bin, but rather I'm drawing a larger envelope around it and starting to positively associate dopamine reward with that larger envelope. And for those of you that are thinking, well, this is just a psychological trick, this is sort of like lying to yourself. It's not, because you're not actually contradicting the fact that some of this is unpleasant. What you're doing is you're taking this entire series of events, what I'm calling this kind of time envelope, and you're associating it with a particular reward that comes later, which for me would be the feeling that, that I've completed this, right? Because for me, that's usually a good feeling. So reward prediction error is beautiful, not just because it's a sort of math of anticipation and reward, or a math of anticipation and disappointment. It's beautiful because you can stretch out or make more narrow the time bins in which reward prediction error works. Reward prediction error is the way in which people navigate four-year degrees, right? I mean, you go, sure, final exam to final exam, et cetera, but ultimately there's a big payoff at the end, and it's all basically for that big payoff. And of course, I understand that it's the journey, not the destination, but let's face it, for a lot of us, goals and habits are about achieving some sort of destination. In the case of Zone 2 cardio, for me, it's about trying to stay alive for as long as I can with vitality, that is. And it's also the fact that if I'm doing that, I get to eat the foods that I like. I tend to be able to eat more, which I happen to really enjoy eating, so much so that I like it just as an activity. So basically what you're trying to do is not restrict your thinking to just the habit that you're trying to form, but rather to grab a hold of the timing before and after that particular habit and start to positively associate reward mechanisms in your brain with that entire time bin. This is a very useful and very powerful tool in order to form habits. And I should say that it's not something that comes naturally to most people. In fact, even as I describe it, you might find it's just still a little bit abstract. But what I encourage you to do, if you are finding it to be a little bit vague, would be to pick the habit that you want to form, write down or think about very concretely what is the sequence of steps involved in the execution of that habit, and then write down or think about what is the sequence of events that need to precede that habit, maybe the immediate 10 or 15 minutes before, as well as the immediate sequence of events and or feelings that will occur after that habit. And then call the whole thing a habit execution, the whole thing a effort to engage in that particular habit. And in doing that, and in positively associating with the idea that you're going to complete that entire sequence, you will engage reward prediction error in the proper way that the dopamine surge can lend itself toward motivation. Because ultimately, dopamine is not about feeling good, it's about feeling motivated. This is something that I've talked about numerous times before, but dopamine, contrary to popular belief, is not a reward molecule as much as it is a molecule of motivation and drive. And the natural consequence of doing the exercise I just described, of writing things out that precede, are involved in the immediate execution of the habit and follow the habit, will allow you to experience an increase in energy and thereby an increase in likelihood that you're going to engage in that entire sequence of events. And the reason for that is that dopamine gives us energy. And the reason for that is that the molecule epinephrine, adrenaline, is actually manufactured from dopamine. Biochemically, it comes from dopamine. So dopamine is powerful, and you can access more dopamine around even habits that you haven't yet formed by taking this broader time envelope and task bracketing that specific task execution or habit execution. Way back at the beginning of the episode, I promised you that I would deliver 2 programs that are geared towards habit formation. And I promised that I would give you ways in which you could gauge whether or not certain habits had moved from high effort, what I call high limbic friction, to reflexive. And we talked about a number of ways to gauge that. In researching this episode, I found a tremendous number of different systems for habit formation. It's really amazing how much is out there. There are ones that are 60 days to this, or 21 days to that, or 18 days to this. I mean, it's just rampant in the popular psychology literature and in the self-help literature.